For context for listeners, and I think this will make sense for people in Sydney, I was looking to buy a $600,000 2-bedroom apartment in Sydney. The question for me was, in 10 years, I'd like to keep working really hard and buy a home. You know, a home with a backyard that I can finally buy a dog and start a family. And whether I'm going to like liquidate my share portfolio or I'm going to sell my apartment, both of those two things will have some kind of cash value that I can use in 10 years. That's kind of where I approached that from. So that's why I was kind of like, well, I have to assume I'll need to sell those shares to, you know, worst case to offset, you know, to get a bigger deposit or offset the house or whatever like that.
Yeah, sure. Okay, that makes sense. So it was mostly a financial decision on what was going to lead to the better long-run outcome in 10 plus years. That was most of the motivation?
Yeah, I guess you'd say that until the age of, I mostly didn't want to buy a house for personal reasons, and then interest rates went up and I was like, absolutely not now. And then I was like, actually, maybe I'll reconsider it, and I'm only going to do this if I think it financially checks out. And that was a part of it. And you mentioned strata and, you know, water and rates and stuff. I think what I found when I was looking at apartments was more like less saying, oh, this one's only $600 a quarter and this one's $1,000 a quarter, and more looking at like, what do they actually have to maintain? Because there's some strata complexes like the one I live in where strata's really low, but it bloody well shows in the common areas too. But the main thing is like the place I live now, they don't have much, like there's no elevators, there's no pools, there's no anything. So whether the strata was 600 or 800, it was more looking at what is there to maintain, because if there's a lot to maintain and your strata's cheap, you're just going to pay for it in a couple of years when someone figures their stuff out, and vice versa. So I very quickly was like, I'm going to stay away from all the high strata places, because if I'm going to start paying a whole bunch of stuff just to service the place I live in, I'll just rent, for goodness sake. That was kind of my attitude. So I ended up, that was a bit of a side tangent, but that's where I ended up on that front.
It can really get up there, man, in terms of strata fees. I've seen some horrendous fees being charged, and sometimes you can see why, right? Because there's pools to maintain, there might be gyms to maintain, there's all these extra facilities around those costs can add up. But man, it's pretty painful if you're an owner versus if you're renting that apartment.
And then I got really scared, Dave, and this is quite a Sydney centric thing too, and then I started to notice that there are a bunch of apartments that were on sale in my suburb that had been bought for the same value back in 2017. And then I went into my kind of like spook phase where I was like, oh man, buying an apartment in Sydney, because people often talk about house prices as literally house prices. I find like, actually, this is a house I bought in the major city and I sold my house for something. People are rarely referring to those numbers with apartments, and I was like, crap, what if I just end up buying this thing with a mortgage and paying strata, and I have to sell it in 5 years for barely anything more or the same price? And then suddenly I'll be like, why in the hell did I even buy an apartment in the first place? Why didn't I just rent for longer? That was a big stressor for me for a while too.
Well, but see, you won't have to worry, mate, because so many people are so one-eyed about buying a home that you'll never have a shortage of people who are just wanting to buy, and that'll end up pushing the price up at some point. So you'll be okay, mate. But that 7-year story about a property being sold for the same price, that's almost unheard of in Sydney. Shouldn't it be like triple that by now?
Well, that's where it got tricky for me, because like I was an apartment buyer, so apartments did have a bit of a different trend to housing. Like you would look at some housing and it would be going up pretty hilariously fast, but then there was an apartment that sold down the road from me for, I think it was like 700. And I saw that someone had bought it in like 2015 for 800 or something. And I think there's a lot of stuff in Sydney where I think, particularly during those booms of 17 and 21, people just like bought anything. And that was my big nervousness, which actually again got me into to kind of keep the story flowing into the stamp duty thing, because my biggest fear wasn't necessarily buying something that wouldn't appreciate. It was buying something that wouldn't appreciate and having to pay the government a fat tax for the privilege of making a mistake, if that makes sense. So that when I kind of read more about the stamp duty exemption for the cheaper end of apartments, and I guess houses if you go really far out, I was like, oh, what's the worst that can happen? I buy it, I learn a bit about property, I sell it in 12 months for what I bought it for, and I go rent again, you know? Like, what can go wrong, right? Like, there's very little actual cost to buying. And like, you know, for transparency, I'm pretty sure the total cost for me to buy was $1,000 I paid to the solicitor conveyancer and the moving costs. That's it for a first home buyer in New South Wales who bought a cheaper place, I guess you'd say, in a city. And that helped me break my confidence a little. That helped me, build up my confidence a bit, because that was my biggest fear. I'm very risk averse. And I was like, man, I don't want to get into the rat race and be a rat.